just a bit about the faculty. I mean, I've been involved in emergency humanitarian healthcare for a long while now. And one of the things that has always struck me about that specifically, but also in more general about global health, is or global health in the sense of people from one country working in another, was to try and normalise it within your own medical or healthcare practice. And so it's, you know, it shouldn't be different. It can be seen as different in that it works, you know, it dances to a different tune, but it shouldn't. Medicine is medicine, and you should try and do it to the highest standard. So if you're going to normalise the way that you practice medicine globally, and particularly in humanitarian emergencies, then there need to be standards. There need to be recognised international standards which you will meet. You need to have a training programme. You need to have a professional home. If you were matching other branches of medicine, you would have a professional home, and you would ultimately have qualifications which would represent the benchmarking of the level of standard that you have reached. So as when you work with other people or other people employ you, they will know that you have been benchmarked to a certain standard. So the first step along that route to get international standards was the WHO Emergency Medical Teams Programme, which I expect you are familiar with. But if not, just Google WHO EMT, go on the website, and on there you will find the Blue Book, which is the minimum standards for emergency medical teams. And they actually extend beyond emergencies. They are core standards for delivering healthcare in an emergency setting. So international standards have been set. With regards to training, WHO has also endorsed a 3-step training of, if you want to work in another country, particularly in an emergency, first of all, be fully qualified in whatever specialty you come from. It's not a place to learn, it's a place for people to benefit from what you've already learned. So you need to complete your specialist training, then some training to adapt that training to the environment you're working in, and then a deployment type training, so as you will learn to work in a different environment. And there's a fourth one added sometimes, just in time training. So for example, in Ebola outbreaks, people will have a further add-on and PPE management and the management of dangerous pathogens. So the training programs are in place. But what about the final bit of a professional home and qualifications? That's where the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh came in. Now, I'm a fellow of this college, and I was also involved in the setting up the Diploma in Immediate Medical Care and ultimately the Faculty of Immediate Medical Care. And in that, I saw that this college had in fact invited not only non-surgeons to be members of the college, but non-medical practitioners, for immediate medical care, paramedics, nurses. So long as you met the standards and the capabilities required, set down, then you could get a diploma, you could go on to get a fellowship. So initially I thought that would be the place for a humanitarian qualification, a humanitarian specialty. In fact, the college, when I put it to the college, they said, it's so important and we value it so much, it should be its own faculty. So we thought, okay, how do we then develop a faculty of humanitarian healthcare? It so happened that the college had also just developed a faculty of remote and rural healthcare. And when we looked at the capabilities framework and the type of people who would be doing this work, we thought there was a remarkable similarity. And so we established the Faculty of Remote, Rural and Humanitarian Healthcare, which has, it is now well established and has been remarkably successful. We're Daniel's just telling me, we're just now finishing the capabilities framework. So if you are going to become a member or a fellow, and when we develop the exams, what are the capabilities that we will expect you to have across different levels of skill sets, from whether you're a basic care provider, a paramedic standard, a nursing standard, a specialist standard, and we've mapped all those out using a whole range of advisors. And now the faculty is open for you to apply for membership and fellowship. The criteria are on the website, and I would encourage you to join. So it was a long time in discussion and concept, but once the college got behind it, it's happened remarkably quickly, and I would encourage you all to join. Thank you very much.
Very much for having me today. Thank you to Anisa for organizing this. It's always tricky to follow Tony after a speech, but I will do it justice. So as Becca said, I'm Ram. I'm the health director at UK Med. I've been in this post for about 2.5 years, 3 if I count the time that I spent in the Beirut port blast, where I responded as part of the team, as the team lead and medical coordinator in August 2020, which was an 8-month response that we had. So I'm going to speak a little bit today about a recent response that we had in Turkey. I'm sure most people are aware of the Turkey earthquake that happened on February 6th of this year. And this is a photo of one of our register members. This is Tim Byram. Maybe some people know him. He's a paramedic from Manchester and taken in one of our tents. So I'm going to go through the response, and I'm also going to speak a little bit about the organization. Here we go. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit and talk about UK Med as an organization, and I'm going to primarily focus on since 2020. So UK Med has existed since 1988. It was actually founded by Tony himself, and it's existed for quite a long time. It's primarily a surge organization, so the bulk of what we do is, as Tony said, is an EMT, so working as an emergency medical team, deploying teams around the world, primarily into, focused around disasters, but actually the bulk of what we've done has been outbreaks. COVID skews that a little bit, obviously, but we have also responded to outbreaks of Ebola, most recently cholera in Malawi, measles in Bangladesh, diphtheria in Bangladesh, measles in Samoa, and a few other outbreaks. And we've responded to disasters in Lebanon, Haiti, the earthquake, 2 instances, and also most recently in Turkey, which I'll speak on. We've done about 40 plus deployments just over the last 3 years now, and we grew really exponentially as an organization. We went from an organization that maybe deployed once a year, once every 18 months, to responding maybe 3 to 5 countries simultaneously over the last few years. A lot of that was during COVID. I'll show a map just after this where we deployed teams all around the globe. But we also have set up a huge country program in Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict last year, which is still running. These numbers are actually, I think, slightly out of date. We've deployed out probably more than 400 staff. I'll show a picture of how we kind of source our teams, but that's international staff that we've deployed that come either from the UK or from international members. And also in our deployments, it's not only around direct delivery of services, so hands-on patient care, but a lot of it ends up being training and capacity building. COVID was very specific for that. So how we generally send teams in is that there's a request from a host Ministry of Health, which is how the EMT mechanism is designed. A host Ministry of Health puts out a request for international assistance, be it during an outbreak, a conflict, or a disaster, and then we respond. So that is transmitted to all partners globally that are verified by WHO, which UK Med is one of them. And then we respond with the offer that we have. But interestingly, during COVID, many of the requests were actually not for patient care, was actually to come in and train people to deliver capacity building and support. We also do a lot of training internally. So for the people that we send out, which is part of the delivery of high standards of care. So we have about over 1,000 people now that we have on our register, and we train those people. We don't train them necessarily to be medics or nurses or anything like that, but we do train them in deploying out and delivering high levels of care, understanding of context, safeguarding, and also understanding the environments that we work in. So there's a lot of internal training. Much of it is done online now, partially because of COVID, but also for the fact that we also expanded our register during COVID and have about a 50-50 split of international and UK based. So it's just simply not cost feasible to bring everyone to the UK for training. but we are starting to go back to much more in-person training as well. A few things that have happened over the past few years. I should say that UKMed is slightly unique in that while we are an independent NGO and can respond as ourselves, we also run the emergency medical team for the British government. So there's about almost 40 now international organizations or governments that are verified by WHO as emergency medical teams. UKMed is one, and the UK government is also one. Most host governments generally manage their own EMTs. So for example, Spain or a few other countries, but the British government outsources it. So we are the primary provider of that. So we can respond as UKMed, or we can respond as the British government as UK EMT. The only real difference is generally the t-shirts. The same people, the oversight of the programs, how we respond is more or less the same. And the bulk of that program, of our delivery as an EMT has been as the UK EMT. So we are funded for 5 years to deliver that program for the British government. So when there's an international call for assistance and the British government chooses to respond, as I'll talk about in Turkey, we deploy out as the British government. We've also been involved quite a bit with the faculty here. There's one of the courses that we've helped to develop. We also commissioned a report on the NHS, which actually looked at something in reverse. Many types of research or outcomes look at what do global responders bring to the country they deploy into. We actually looked at the opposite. What do we, when we deploy people out, what do they bring back to the NHS or to their host system? And actually, the report showed a lot in terms of the resilience that people gained, in terms of the team building skills that they get, and also generally the increase in knowledge that they had from a lot of the responses that they went out to. And one I actually missed, which is a huge one, is that we verified as an emergency medical team last year. So UKMed was the 38th global team to be verified by WHO. This is just a quick map of where we've responded. The bulk has been over the past few years. You can see quite a bit of range. So the ones in pink are UKMed, and the ones in blue is us responding as the British government, as the UK EMT. Primarily across sub-Saharan Africa, but there's also been responses in the Middle East, even in the Pacific. So we've deployed into the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea as well, and some other responses into Bangladesh and a few other countries. And we also were involved in setting up the Nightingale in Manchester, which Tony was a big part of. So the first one I want to say is, before I come on to Turkey and some of the responses, is that one thing that we really learned as an organization, I'm sure many others did, is from the pandemic, was the need to be adaptable and flexible. Emergency medical teams were really constructed around primarily responding into disasters. And while Turkey was a disaster, the bulk of what, like I said, where we have responded has been to other types of situations, outbreaks, conflicts, etc. So the adapting and flexibility of responses and the types of people you send out is key. And also, I would probably say that for 98% of our deployments, there has been no infrastructure. We've simply sent people out. The requests have been for people. And so while the construct has always been really around infrastructure, we very much see that people are the kind of the gold in this thing. So it's been people embedding into host Ministry of Health facilities. It's been people embedding into other EMTs or doing mobile clinics with other partners. The adaptability part, I just want to focus on really quickly on 3 responses. So Lebanon, Papua New Guinea, and recently Malawi. It's also the adaptability within responses. So we very often see that the call for assistance is one thing, but the way we respond is very different. In Lebanon, there was a huge port blast in August of 2020. Most teams that deployed, including governments, NGOs, and militaries, came out for trauma, and the actual, what we ended up responding to was COVID. Most of the trauma was picked up by the host system in the first day or 2. And most teams that came out were quite surprised that within 48 hours, there was no trauma remaining. Obviously, there was trauma in the hospitals, but there was no trauma to be treated. The host system was strong enough to pick it up, and we ended up deploying for 8 months and doing COVID in public hospitals. Papua New Guinea, it's also on the time, was a request for COVID that started and took us about 6 months to deploy the team because of various waves and entry points and logistics to get the team into country. And recently in Malawi, where we deployed a team to do a cholera treatment center at the end of January. There was a cyclone that then hit in the south of the country, and we mobilized some of the team to the south. We did a surgical program for a few weeks and then actually deployed out more people and ran mobile clinics, and that just wrapped up a few days ago. So essentially 3 responses within 1. And in terms of as an organization, we've had to drastically scale up the number of register members. So historically, our register was purely NHS, was about 500 people. During COVID, we didn't have access to them. The government did not give access to those people due to domestic emergency, so we had to rapidly scale up and recruit lots of international members. And like I said, that number has now become about 50-50. It's about 500 or so from the NHS, 500 international. The skill sets and expertise, during COVID, we obviously needed lots more intensivists and specific skill sets, but over the last few years, we've drastically increased the numbers of surgeons, emergency physicians, etc. Deployments like Ukraine and Turkey have been case in point where we've needed large amounts of that. Background and experience, as we deploy more into conflicts, it requires different skill sets to be able to work in those environments, and also our core staff as well. This is slightly outdated, so the left part is a little bit outdated, but anyway, the left part is where we as an organization, how we oversee our responses, but the right is kind of the key point. We deploy we have a deployable capability of about 1,000 health professionals. That ranges from physicians, nurses, auxiliary staff, logistics, operations, etc. And as I said, half come from the NHS and half from the humanitarian world. What does that allow us to do? One, UK Med as an organization is the most globally deployed EMT purely because of this workforce balance. The NHS staff are obviously highly skilled and highly trained, but can only go out for shorter periods of time. So we maintain them on an on-call list. People sign up and are available to be on call and deploy at short notice, and usually can go out for the first phase. So in Turkey, that was an example that we used for the first 1 or 2 teams. We can immediately deploy teams out and meet the WHO standards of having teams on the ground ready to respond within 72 hours. And then we also have an experienced humanitarian staff who have a great understanding of difficult contexts, have worked in austere environments, and have much longer availability to deploy. So it also allows us to respond for much longer periods of time. I would say on average, our shortest deployments are about 6 weeks, but we've had deployments that have been about 8 months. Ukraine has been running for about 15 or 16 months now. So with that balance, we can do much longer term deployments as well. So Turkey. So on February 6th, obviously everyone knows a large scale earthquake hit Turkey in a region about the size of Germany. Just to put it into, and the impact is estimated at about 2,000 times Hiroshima. So you can imagine the scale that this hit. Epicenter is kind of where that red dot is, just north of Gaziantep, but obviously hit into northwest Syria, and tremors were felt in Israel, Cyprus, Lebanon, and a few other areas. Greater than 50,000 people died, not obviously in the immediate incident, but over time, and lots of numbers obviously in northwest Syria as well, and some underreported. This is some photos of the destruction that happened. There'll be more as well, and a member of our team. So we responded as the UK EMT. Turkey put out an international call for assistance, and we responded as part of the British government. It's coming up separate. All right. So again, earthquake February 6th morning, we had an assessment team on the ground in less than 24 hours. It would have been slightly shorter, but we had some delays in getting across. So team on the ground in Turkey so the earthquake happened February 6th morning. I think within 18 hours, we had a team on ground. That was a few people from the UK, including our CEO, Tim, who was in the first photo, and a surgeon. And then we had members who came also from Sweden and a few other countries. So we had about 5 or 6 people in country within the first 24 hours. And then we deployed out a team in the next few days. I'll come on to it in a second. We deployed together. Actually, this was a joint response, a joint offer from the British government of the UK emergency medical team, so civilian-led, and the Ministry of Defence. So the UK Ministry of Defence sent out their Type 2 field hospital, which was from Cyprus. And we also worked alongside the Turkish emergency medical team. So this photo here at the bottom is actually from the initial days of the setup. You can see the local ambulance service, the Turkish ambulance service, and some of the tents, with the red tents are the Turkish, and the kind of beige ones are UK government. We started to treat patients on February 13th. The only reason for the delay was there was a few days of negotiation. We had an entry point in, so teams can come into country and assess, but to be able to actually offer support and work to WHO standards, your offer needs to be accepted. The government, obviously, in the chaos of all of this, took a few days to accept the offer, and only accepted the offer when it was a joint deployment and there was a Type 2 field hospital set up. So our deployment was very much a Type 1, which is focused on outpatient types of care, so primary health care, obstetrics, gynecology, pediatrics, rehab, etc., and a bit of emergency care. but the government very much wanted type 2s. I'll come on to in a second, though, about why that wasn't actually the best. As I said, we started treating patients within a few days. The military was slightly behind and started their setup on the 15th, but we were treating patients already and working jointly in the facility alongside Turkish colleagues. And we also started mobile clinics on the 19th of February. The reason for the mobile clinics, as you'll see in the photo here, is it's quite a mountainous area where we deployed into. And so there was a lot of villages where they didn't have access even prior to the earthquake. So it was quite needed to actually provide outreach services to those areas. As I said, team on the ground within 24 hours. There was a period of negotiation with the government and local partners. What was found was that by day 4 or 5, most of the trauma needs were again met, as I mentioned, in Lebanon. Most were either evacuated the area to referral facilities that weren't impacted by the earthquake. So there was a hospital in the area we deployed, but that was found to be structurally unstable. And most were evacuated out. The Turkish health system was extremely impressive. They, in the first few days of the first day of the earthquake, evacuated about 10,000 patients, which is actually phenomenal when you think about it, to organize that and have the system in place. And those were referred to areas as far as Istanbul, which is about a 24-hour drive. Many people were also evacuated to certain areas, but the area we were in, and I'll show it in the next slide, was quite a bit of a poor area. So many people didn't have the means to leave the area. So some left on their own, some were evacuated out. Immediate high needs of secondary trauma and obviously living conditions highly impacted. These are from some of the areas that we deployed into or we assessed. So large scale destruction across the board, and gaps in terms of primary healthcare was a big issue. Even prior to the earthquake. So primary healthcare, OBGYN services, peds rehab, and mental health, obviously from the impacts of the earthquake. Why was that? Well, there's obviously existing gaps, but also for the fact that many physicians actually left the area. Many moved to Istanbul, many went to stay with families, so there was suddenly a shortage in workforce in that area, which we came in to supplement. This was the town we worked in, which was called Turkulu. It was a population of about 80,000, many which remained again, or remained in the surrounding areas. A poor area, but had most health services. There was a hospital prior, and there was good, decent referral systems, but not to the level that you would see in much larger Turkish areas. And many medical staff obviously took weeks to return to the area because there was constant tremors, especially for the first few weeks. This is the hospital, actually. That was actually next to where we were situated. So initially we considered to work within the hospital, but you can see there's quite a bit of damage. It's not so clear, but there was actually cracks that ran right through the facility. And one night there was also a fire. It was deemed to be safe and stable. There was some batteries left in the CT machine and it caught on fire in the middle of the night. So, okay. So this is a bit of photos of what we set up. So we set up a type 1 hospital, as I said, primarily focused on outpatient alongside the Ministry of Defense field surgical unit and the Turkish facility. It was an integrated facility. On the top left is one of our core staff, our HR member. This is a command and control center, which kind of looking after the operations, but also for core staff to work in. There's also photos on the bottom left, which is a living condition. So it was tenting. Obviously, there was some structures still standing, but they weren't deemed to be sound, so people tented. Those early days, it was about -15, -20. It was extremely cold. Rich, who deployed, can obviously speak to that. It got a little bit warmer, but then it started to get rainy. So quite difficult living conditions. The top shows basically the nighttime. So we had catering services, but people had to basically sleep in cold tents. And we didn't have running water. Well, we had running water for the facility, but we didn't have showers. So we were moving people about an hour to Gaziantep every 5 to 6 days for shower and a night in a hotel, so rest. There's some photos of the facility itself. So we come out with everything, all of the tents, all of the infrastructure, medication supplies. That's part of our self-sustainability as an emergency medical team. So all of that was deployed out and actually donated on to Turkish authorities when we exited. So we had about a 8 to 10 week deployment in total, and we donated onto the Turkish authorities. And on the bottom right, you can see this is from the early days, so there's still snow on the mountains, the integration of that facility. So triage was done through the Turkish tents. A lot of the primary healthcare was done by us, and any surgical cases were referred onto the Ministry of Defense. We did find, I'll put on the next slide. that even with this integration of the facility, as I said, a lot of the trauma was picked up. So actually the Ministry of Defense ended up working in our tents and doing a lot of primary healthcare consultations, including surgeons. There was some trauma cases that needed follow-up, but actually the Ministry of Defense actually exited after about two or three weeks. Also donated on a lot of their tents and equipment, but it was found that primary healthcare and the continuation of kind of gaps in obstetrics and gynecology, etc., was still remaining in the weeks coming. So we extended the deployment. As I said, we also did mobile clinics in surrounding areas. At our peak, we had about 400 plus patients. I think the highest we had was about 600 if we include the mobile clinics as well. So quite a busy footprint. There was patients that either had pre-existing conditions, there was patients that were affected by the trauma of the earthquake, but we also saw lots of pediatrics cases, so coughs and colds, so simple cases we might have seen even if there was no earthquake. And by the end of the response, if we count the total numbers across the entire facility, it was about 20,000 patients. So we were the last emergency medical team to remain in country and then exited out. Many stayed for about 2 to 3 weeks. We had, as I said, about 8 to 10 weeks in total, integrated with the Turkish authorities and then handed it back over. And all of the medications and remaining supplies were then offered onto the local authorities. So we did see by the end that many physicians, nurses, et cetera, were returning and facilities were repaired and able to function. And so all of the patient data and things like that were also handed over to the local services. And that's a photo of our team in the very early days, in one of the warmer days. But yeah, we deployed about, in total, if we include the local staff, we had about 130 people that worked in our facility and about 60 or 70 from across 9 countries that deployed in our facility. And I will wrap up there. Thank you.
We might have time for a couple of questions here if anybody's got a few burning questions that they want to ask. Otherwise, we can ask them at the Q&A at the end. Yeah.
So I was just intrigued that you said you were invited, and then when you got there was a delay because of negotiations. So was that not, were the terms not specified when you were invited? I'm just intrigued that it took days when you were there when you could have been doing something. Yeah,
no, that's a valid question. This is the usual thing. It's a fairly interesting thing of how the mechanism is designed. It's meant to be invite only. But very often you find that either host ministers of health or the WHO in the country which puts out the offer either puts a lot of restrictions on entering, even though it's a surge response. So as I said, some responses have taken us about 5 or 6 months to negotiate entry. That was COVID, which was interesting because the government puts out a request for assistance, yet wants you to follow all normal protocols. So normally what should happen is the country should waive, for example, visa requirements. They should waive customs requirements. Things like bringing controlled drugs should be waived. Because if you're a verified team by WHO is basically saying, we've authorized and we guarantee that these people work to a standard and they allow you to come in for that set period. Many countries still want you to follow that system. The issue in Turkey was actually the fact that the government requested for field hospitals. And our initial offer was actually for a primary healthcare setup. And the host government actually didn't understand the difference. So there's this terminology that's used by WHO and Ministers of Health, which are type 1s, type 2s, and the government simply put out a request for type 2s and type 3s. Type 3s are a level up, which have intensive care, but only 2 teams globally have that, 2 or 3. And so they rejected the initial offer. But then when we went back and actually met them in person and explained what the offer was, they accepted. So that took a few days. The other one was also the fact that we deployed, as I said, through the Ministry of Defense. And so everything that was shipped was via the Ministry of Defense, and their flights were coming via Cyprus and ours via the UK. So there was a day or two to actually clear customs in the UK to exit out. So the delay wasn't purely on the Turkish side, it was partially even here. So in general, I think we got there in a fairly rapid period of time. As I said, we started to work within the Turkish facility, so some of the people who were on ground were already treating, but the full setup took a few days to get going. Yeah.
So just a quick question about poisoning. Médecins Sans Frontières have a specialist unit looks at methanol toxicity because we get epidemics of methanol suddenly coming out. You talk about the human resources and how this is a key part of what you offer. Do you cover toxicology? Do you cover poisoning epidemics or incidents? Thanks.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily a big part. We are actually looking at something like that. As I said, the primary focus of WeGoat is usually in outbreaks, disasters, or conflicts, not necessarily. And we haven't had a large amount of those types of cases, but it's probably a part that we need to expand into, I would say, moving forward.
Hello, everyone. Just to let you know, I am standing in today for Andrew Fryer, who is our international manager, international head. He wished he could have been here, but unfortunately he's currently in Gaziantep with our Northwest Syria programme. So I'm here in his stead to give you a little bit of an update on RCEM's international work and to give you an overview on our programme in Uganda. So I'd also like to extend our thanks on behalf of the college to the Global Emergency Care Collaborative for inviting us to participate today. We know that linking everyone together in such a huge sphere of emergency care and global sort of standing is a very difficult job, and we just want to sort of let you know how grateful we are for all of your hard work. What you've achieved so far is absolutely phenomenal. So we'd also like to extend our thanks to the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh for having us today as well. So firstly, we'd like to thought it would be helpful to share some of the strategic aims of the GEM committee and the international team. We're currently working on developing this strategy. It's not an easy task. It's something that is sort of developing all the time. It's a work in progress. So basically, our strategic aims are to contribute to improvement in global emergency medicine outcomes by strengthening emergency care systems in low and low middle income countries, emerging economies, through high quality evidence-based capacity building, training and education. We'd like to build a presence and reputation of the college as a leading voice and actor in global emergency medicine. We'd like to build a coherent body of global work funded by a range of donors, maximising the potential of the RCEM members, staff and partners, and to be a leader in providing RCEM members with access to key learning resources, humanitarian guidance, supervisor guidance around global emergency medicine. So this is something that we are sort of working on. Our Global Emergency Medicine Committee has a wide array of experience, and we're trying to sort of harness that. Something that we are very much looking to do in the future is to provide a better network for our members and fellows working in the global health sphere. Something that is in progress and is being spearheaded by Anisa is our global mapping project, which is something that we've sort of tried to do for a very long time, but it takes a huge amount of work and effort. And having Anisa and her team sort of spearheading and trying to push this work forward, and Claire, of course, is something that's going to be sort of very helpful in connecting our members and fellows, promoting the work that's out there on opportunities that can be shared with others so people can get involved. So to give you a bit of background, the RCEM team is a headcount of 2. We've grown since 2020, so we're still at the beginning of our journey. However, this is a bit of an overview of some of the work that we've achieved so far. So to start off with, apologies. To start off with, we have a partnership with the Ghana College of Physicians and Surgeons. This started in 2021. Began initially with a review and feedback process of their curriculum and developing a framework and set of resources to be replicated as best practice across other specialties. This work has been funded by the FCDO and THET, and we're now in the kind of second year of this partnership. So in 2022, the GARDA team carried out an international accreditation assessment visit, focusing on identifying areas for improvement and providing appropriate responses and recommendations. They carried out workshops on workplace-based assessments, and the later visit included further sessions on assessment in postgraduate medical training, and practical workshop on carrying out workplace-based assessments. Apologies. So follow-up work for this programme will include virtual workshops on quality improvement and leadership in EM, with a view to supporting the college to create their own quality improvement committee and structure, so that this knowledge can be cascaded down so it's more sustainable, and also workshops virtually on EM leadership and in developing their faculty for sustainability and future work. So currently, as I mentioned, our international head is currently in Gaziantep, so for our Northwest Syria programme. So there's a very long acronym here, the MAWARID programme. So that's the Mapping and Scoping Assistance to Healthcare Workers and Human Resources for Health, including the design of future support to core quality assurance, education and representative functions for the medical profession. We did not come up with that acronym. It's very long, but basically the funding for this has come by the European Union. So the key involvement of RCEM is to help promote the specialty of EM and support advocacy. The devastating earthquakes, obviously, in February has understandably delayed some of our plans for this. However, it really has enforced the need for emergency care and training. So currently there's a Train the Trainer workshop happening in Gaziantep at the moment. There are, I believe, 5 emergency medicine specialists in Northwest Syria, and they, I believe, have been agreed for funding for other trainees in emergency medicine. So we're trying to currently sort of gather interest in the specialty and sort of move emergency medicine training forward there. So we're working with the Syrian Board of Medical Specialties, SBOMs, Idlib and Aleppo health directorates and training sites across Northwest Syria. We're trying to understand current medical education, how it works there, and how to strengthen these identified gaps. So this programme is developed and delivered working with diaspora and also sort of members and fellows with global emergency medicine experience and interest to take that work forward. Accreditation is something that we've been working on. We have delivered international accreditation in Iceland and in Egypt. We were invited to take forward this work with the Egyptian Ministry of Health. So this assessment is based on identifying gaps, designing appropriate responses and recommendations. The key standards for this programme underpin the accreditation process, and they're drawn from the published and evaluated UK generic standards of education. They have a general application for medical education. However, for each time we work on an accreditation, they will be applied with acknowledgement of the local context in delivery of training. That's to say the regional, national and institutional needs will be assessed and considered. It's our first, really, our international programme is the Emergency Medicine Foundation Programme. It's a one-year programme and it's meant to be as a kind of foundation entry into emergency medicine for sort of junior trainees, and it provides an in-depth training utilising a bespoke curriculum. So this programme has now been up and running since 2019. It's completed 3 successful years, and the 4th year is currently in progress. The pandemic early on in the first year of the programme meant that virtual learning had to be relied on very heavily, and delivery was adjusted to be fully virtual until we were able to visit again in 2020 when we carried out face-to-face workshops to instil things like self-reflection, workplace-based assessment, and there's a train the trainer programme, which is to help the development of the supervisors as well as the trainees. So there's no exam for this programme, but there's an end of programme review panel, which is kind of based on the UK ARCP process. So currently over 150 trainees has passed the programme, completing the end of programme review panel. 98% of all surveyed supervised trainees, and 100% of surveyed supervisors rated the curriculum as easy to follow. Trainees showed significant improvement with their confidence in professional skills, resuscitation, trauma and acute presentations in all key areas. The programme aims to instil a culture of documenting learning objectives and achieving them, which has been kind of a major achievement, as it's sort of a shift in sort of how training is structured and delivered there. So, spotlight on Uganda. So we've been engaging in discussions since 2018. Our relationship started when we were approached by the Uganda-UK Health Alliance, which I believe is funded by Health Education England, now NHS England. So what initially began as discussions for training faculty support to be delivered wholly by volunteers has eventually developed into a health partnership to which aims to facilitate the exchange of healthcare knowledge, ideas, skills, working practices, technologies and research. So we've got a picture here of we had the Permanent Secretary, the Honourable Diana Atwini, who came to the RCEM offices to sign an MOU in April of this year. We continue discussions within the SCALE programme in order to take this work forward. In 2022, we had our first visit to assess the sites, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. So just to give you a little bit of background in the development of emergency medicine training in Uganda, we have pictures here of our 2022 William Rutherford International Award winner, Dr. Derek Harborne. So he's an RCEM fellow and spent over 10 years working with Mbarara University of Science and Technology and their regional referral hospital to develop the first emergency medicine master's programme in Uganda, which is one of only 2 master's programmes in the country. So we can see that he's presenting here with Dr. Priska Kazito. So she was at that time the Emergency Care Society President. This is at our annual scientific conference in Belfast. Dr. Priska Kazito graduated from the first batch of MEd residents, and now she's leading EM at Mbarara as head of the department and is supporting the RCEM Uganda partnership. So this programme aims to support the Ministry of Health's aims to develop EM, working closely with the Emergency Care Services Uganda and the Uganda-UK Health Alliance. They have a target to develop 400 emergency medicine doctors in the next 5 years, which, as you can imagine, with only 2 training programmes currently is quite a tall order. But we're aiming to help them to support them in achieving this goal. The desire is there's also the desire to develop pre-hospital emergency care and ambulance services. However, this is slightly out of scope at this stage, and harnessing the knowledge and experience of our members and fellows to support the EM training and development is far more achievable and sustainable at this point. So we will be looking to support the regional referral hospitals and their accident and emergency departments, which are their entry points for emergencies. So we aim to provide support with development across key areas such as exams, curriculum development, international medical exchange, which we'll talk about a bit later on, research, training of clinical officers, medical officers and nurses involved in delivering care in the regional referral hospitals. So in 2022, we did a site visit to Uganda and we met with the Ministry of Health there also. So we visited the sites which are identified as regional centres of excellence by the Ministry of Health. So we split into two teams and we met with key stakeholders at each site. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of sites that we visited there in a whistle-stop tour, and we visited the regional referral hospital at each point and their twinned training facility, their institution, which is normally their local university. Here we have some pictures of some of our visits. So, as I mentioned, we met with the key stakeholders at each hospital and each university to get a better idea of how emergency care was delivered and by whom, as well as how the training was delivered, what the training facilities were like and were available in terms of lecture facilities, whether they had internet access, simulation or lab availability for clinical skills development. We found in quite a few of the regional referral hospitals, they actually didn't have any sort of emergency medicine doctors there delivering the care, and it was delivered sort of quite a lot by medical officers and nurses. So obviously it became very clear to us that the programme also will need to include sort of development of the multidisciplinary team, which is something that we'll be doing via clinical grand rounds where everyone involved in emergency care is invited. So the first phase, develop e-learning and virtual support. Grand rounds is something that we started last year, and it's something that's going to be ongoing and continue for a long time, I would imagine. It's something that's obviously very easily done in terms of not being very costly. It allows us to reach people that we wouldn't normally be able to reach if we were doing training in person, and it allows a good sort of exchange of knowledge and experience from sites in the UK to sites in Uganda. We are providing access to RCEM annual conferences virtually, and we have plans to support with faculty development in terms of one-on-one mentorship with new faculty within partnerships with the scale sites. We're also looking to provide access possibly to our EM Leaders online platform. However, obviously the EM Leaders programme is very UK centric, so there'll be scope in the future to develop modules which are developed specifically for the context. Also part of phase one is international exchanges. We can see some pictures here. We had two residents from Uganda come and visit and do an observership in January of this year. So obviously sites in Uganda are looking to develop a critical mass of EM leads in Uganda. So these are short observerships that we're facilitating, and obviously it's very key that we work with the training institutions to develop their objectives beforehand. So the placements were 4 weeks long, and we agreed objectives, as I said, in advance, and we also finished with sort of lessons learnt and things to look at in the future. So this provided opportunity to observe clinical work in the NHS setting, attend key educational activities across the two London sites, and both of the observers visited. They were paired with a supervisor at each site, which allowed them to achieve a tailored experience. So also within phase one is fundraising. So Funds raised are to support the following areas: increase capacity for EM staff for the virtual EM training at Malago Hospital, provide PPE and emergency care materials and equipment to support the delivery of basic emergency care, patient monitors at Malago Hospital, an Ambuman advanced wireless for Gulu, and funds to support African EM doctors to attend AFCEM in Accra through the Superdale programme. So as you can see a picture here of some of the equipment being received. We've got the Honourable Permanent Secretary also there. Also in phase 1 is research and develop an evidence base. So there's been 2 global research awards awarded in the past last 4 years. We have evaluated triage interventions, processes and procedures in the emergency departments. We're looking to support the gaps in knowledge of healthcare workers in the EDs in all aspects of triage and patient care. There is a triage protocol which the departments do follow, but it's a case of working with the sites on how the guidelines are sort of implemented. Burnout and associated factors among medical and nursing emergency department staff and trainees in Uganda. This is obviously a thing seen all around the world after the pandemic. So this is something that's obviously a growing topic of interest. And we're looking to see if there are research grants to complete with Ugandan partners. So phase 2 is global placement of UK professionals. So this is to support emergency care training and practice and research. It's an opportunity to create an entry point in any given facility for identifying, analysing and addressing the wider array of factors affecting institutional quality for care for patients. We're also looking to support longer term interventions in terms of sustainable quality improvement processes, focusing on clinicians, medical officers and nurses. And we'll be looking at some point in the future to recruit focused UK professionals who are prepared to commit to a minimum of 6 months, but this is sort of down the line once we've sort of looked for funding for this. And phase 3 is Ugandan fellowship. So this is something that we'll be looking to explore. It's something that the Ugandan Ministry of Health is very keen on, but in order to work on these fellowships, we'll be working with the Ministry of Health to release academic or ministry staff, apologies. So we'll be based on some of our models observed during the scoping visit, and it will be possibly looking to utilise the MTI scheme. Obviously, this is something that we won't be doing until way later down in the line, because obviously there's so few emergency medicine doctors to promote them. Leaving for 2 years wouldn't be sustainable for them, and it wouldn't be great in terms of training new emergency medicine doctors. So this is something that we'll be doing later down the line or looking at. Ensuring there's a critical mass required at the centres of excellence in delivering the MED EM. And we'll be looking to look at clinical placements with specific competency-based postmasters objective set and forming a key component of the training. We'll be looking for fellows to return to Uganda for an existing position created in an agreed scale site or regional referral hospital. In order to make these sort of work most effectively, we'll be looking to identify UK trusts to form health partnerships to collaborative exchanges, which really sort of work to meet the goals of the programme and to ensure that the exchange is an exchange of knowledge in both ways. So we'll be also recruiting members and fellows as long-term fellowships to replace outgoing clinicians. So if somebody is coming over to the UK, we would like to replace them so that there's no sort of loss in support or service. And we'll be looking to see if some virtual support could also be provided for the early stages of the MED programme, but also really sort of working with the site so that any UK fellow that goes in to work in the training programme is done so in a way that really sort of helps and not hinders their programme. So that's a whistle-stop tour of our work so far.
Thanks for inviting me. Hello, everybody. It was great supervising Anisa's PhD. I learned so much. What you mentioned then about global health and humanitarian medicine are important, because these phrases like global health, well, in fact, that we should all have health globally. Should it actually become a subject by itself? Now, you might think that's quite academic, but it does have implications for who considers it global. It's normally the more well-off countries talk about global health, and the less well-off countries just talk about the health that they would like to meet a global standard. So whilst we might use these phrases, I think we have to be careful about them. But on the other hand, if we don't use them, we often lose the language that is needed to communicate. Now, Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute, when we set that up, you might be surprised to know, but the biggest discussion we had about as to whether or not we should include the word humanitarian in the title, because as Anisa was alluding to it, we should all be humanitarians. We should adhere to the humanitarian principles. But then we thought, well, if we don't include it in the title, people won't know what we're doing. And so I don't have an answer to it, and I don't think you can ditch these terms, but I do think we ought to be aware of them. So Anisa asked me just to reflect on a few things that spring to mind, just looking back on my career as I now glide into retirement. How to win friends and influence people. I don't know if you are aware of where the phrase comes from. People use it all the time. It was Dale Carnegie in the 1930s who wrote this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it was really a self-help book, one of the first self-help books. He helped himself to market himself by changing the spelling of his name. It's actually EY at the end, but because he thought, well, it's pronounced the same as Carnegie, who does all the libraries and all the good work. If I change the spelling of my name, people might think we're related, which they weren't, but he promoted himself that way. It's still selling well, and his courses are still running to help. But as was pointed out, he also did another very good one, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. So he did all these self-help things, but, and this is the point, it was pointed out not long after he published his book, which was very well received. You're teaching people to smile and bob and pretend to be interested in other people's hobbies, precisely so that you may screw things out of them. And one of the things he says, to get to never talk about yourself, always ask people about themselves. What hobbies do you have? Ask them about their family, ask them about this, while you're trying to sell them vacuum cleaners or whatever. And it struck me that we've got to be very careful in global health, or even in emergency humanitarian assistance, going to work in other countries. Are we trying too much to sell ourselves? What is it that we're doing? Are we really interested in what other people are doing? I hope we are. But when I looked at where the origin of the phrase came from, I thought we have to be very careful about that. And then, of course, there's the opposite. The infamous Toby Young published a book, How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, which also became a film. And that we also need to be very aware of that, because what he did in the book, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he goes to New York and he's just an absolute bore, and he thinks everything British is better. He's rude to people, and he, you know, he alienates everybody. We've got to be very careful about that, to not think that what we're doing is better than what other people are doing. So, one of the principles I've stuck to throughout my career and throughout both working in the UK and also overseas is to see what the developments we've made in emergency medicine should just be extended outwards. I'm old enough to remember when pre-registration house officers, as they were then, could discharge people from casualty departments. Medical students could work. It's been transformed. They're no longer places where people went to learn, but they are places where people who've learned can give what they've learned to their patients. And we need to do that in the emergency setting. So it does mean that to do this work, you need to have something to offer. And there is a problem for us in that, how do you learn it? You don't want to get into a catch-22 situation. But I think we do have to address it so as that you can be learning and training as you are in this country, but not going to work in other countries at a level that you're not trained for and that you're not really adding anything to what they already have. So some issues. If you're going to do global health, emergency humanitarian assistance, when in your career? I'd been a consultant for 4 years before I did my first overseas thing. I hadn't done anything before. So I've never shared in having to fix it into a training program. I'd already completed my training. That was exceptional. But how do we fit it into your career? And I think you need to square that up. Are you going to integrate it into your career, or is it just going to be an add-on, something you do in special leave or even in your vacations? I know some people take leave to do it, and it's just separate to their careers. I would personally like to see it integrated more and more into your careers. There have been fellowship posts that integrate emergency medicine and global health, and I think we need to see those expanded. There is an appetite for it within health education, or NHS as it is now, because I know in the west of Scotland they've funded a number of posts because they couldn't recruit people, but they've funded more posts than they need, and the fourth one can then go and work overseas, and it's cheaper than employing locums. So there are ways of doing it, but I think we need to integrate it into our career. But the faculty of remote rural and humanitarian healthcare really helps with that, because when you are negotiating with the NHS, then if this is part of your training, if this is part of the work that you do, and you can show you've got qualifications and training in that, it can make it easier. But what traps are there out there for us in doing this work? Beware the temptation to drop standards. Particularly you've got limited resources, you're in a low income setting, and in a setting where you might consider standards are not what you're used to. I tell myself to differentiate between the level of care I offer to a person and the standard of care. I try to give the highest standard of care I can to the best of my ability, although recognising I might have to alter the level of care to an individual patient given the resources I have. You may be thinking that's just semantics. It's not. I think if you start off by saying I'm going to drop my standards, then the level of care will fall down anyway. So I think you've got to recognise that you're still trying to do the best you can to the highest standard, even though the level of care might have to be adjusted. There can be a lack of supervision. You've got to recognise that. I would like to see proper training programs where you can be supervised in your international deployment, whether that be in an emergency or as it's being developed, say in Pakistan or wherever you're working in another country, you will be supervised. So it meets the same standards as you would in this country. But I think if you're doing this, you have to be aware, I'm supervised, if I'm supervised back in the UK, should I be supervised there, and how do I arrange that? And to work within your competencies. It can get very tempting when there is not sufficient supervision to stray outside of your areas of competence. That is a risk to the patient, but believe me, it's a risk to you. I've seen people who get a sort of moral injury for having strayed too far out of their competencies and not been able to deal with the unfortunate consequences. And just do normal things. I've found to make sure people have proper record keeping is the benchmark for this. Making sure that they have normal standards and that they are accountable. It's normalising the healthcare that you give in, maybe abnormal circumstances, but you should still give normal healthcare. Then ask yourself, is it for you? It might not be for you. I'm sure people in emergency medicine will see that some people can be very attracted into work in emergency medicine because the idea of it, but when they actually experience it, it is clearly not for them. And it can be hard for them to face up to it, and it can be hard for others to make them face up to it. But we're not all suited to it, and we're not all suited to it all of our life. But I think it's very important that people face up to that. So people have to be honest about it. And it's not just in emergencies. There is a general risk in going to work in a low middle income country. So you have to assess your risk appetite honestly. And you can say no. And those involved in whether it's deployment programs or just general global health programs, you've got to make sure that people understand you can say no. It's okay. And you can say not now, but maybe later. There is no penalty for it. We want people to not do this work under any sort of pressure, which is often just self-pressure. And make sure your risk appetite is shared with your family. I'm not so sure I've been very good at that, to be honest. We've managed just about. Explore your motives and values. I think this is important across it. When it comes to when you think about global health and you think about humanitarianism and all these things, it's about motives and values. So who are you doing it for? And it might be I'm doing it for me. Okay, but I think you need to be honest. I've always tried to be brutally honest with myself and ask myself, why am I doing it? And it is for me, at least acknowledge that, because then you can judge the decisions that you're making when you're in the field. And then why are you doing it? Is it for a sense of adventure? I think most of us would be disingenuous if we said it wasn't. And people say, oh, no, no, it is adventurous to go to any other country. It's to go into an emergency. It is an adventure. And I think you have to face up to that and then say, but is that the only reason? If it's the only reason, then go on an adventure holiday. But I think you have to face up to it. It will be part of it. Some people do it for religious motives. Fine, if that's what it is, but acknowledge what it is. That's your motivation. I did a diploma in the philosophy of medicine and learnt the word deontological. And that is where you do it because of itself you think it's a good thing. So it's not religious. You just consider it to be of itself a good thing, like Immanuel Kant. You can see I've been on the course. And many people in humanitarian work, I think, do it for deontological reasons. Of themselves, they think it is a good thing to do. And I think you should recognise that and not be ashamed of it if you think it's... Because often people are a bit shy about saying it's a good thing. I do it. Why not? It's a good thing to do. So that... But also, it's got to be of value. That's the utilitarian approach in philosophy. It's not just about the doing, it's what you've done. And is there ultimately a benefit to what you've done? And I think in global health and in emergency response, there is a combination. I think it's deontological motives, it's a good thing that motivate people to do it, but I think we have to be utilitarian in its assessment. At the end of the day, other than you feeling good, what did you actually do? What did you actually show? And that's what we've got to pick up on in these huge areas for research. It can be difficult, but not impossible. And I think we owe it to ourselves now to increase the research input into this area, because it's not enough just to do it because it's good. We need to know that we are doing good. And if you're communicating risk to people who might deploy, be absolutely frank about the risks. When we deployed people to Ebola, we were very frank about, you might get Ebola and this is what will happen to you. Most people were not deterred by that. We tell them about the risk of earthquakes when we worked in conflicts. You may die. There are personal risks to you. There are professional risks. Before I got a full-time academic post, there were great threats to my NHS career by spending so much time abroad. And if you recognise risks with people deploying, do everything you can to mitigate those risks, but you cannot remove them. You've got to go through with your teams all the what ifs, even if they're just deploying to a country where there are diseases they wouldn't face here. Go through every what if and protect volunteers from themselves. That's always been my biggest challenge. People are good-hearted, they want to volunteer, it's exciting. And one of the questions we asked when deploying to Ebola was, are you frightened of getting Ebola? And some people said no, and we didn't deploy them. And make sure people can withdraw at any time with no explanation required. And prepare, practice, and have a plan. So what have I learned? Conscious of time. If you're going to do this work, only go if you're asked. Don't be an uninvited and an unwelcome guest. I've seen too much of that. Do what you've been asked or promised to do. Not what you think should be done or prefer to do. Don't give what you have, give what you're being asked for. So, and it may not be what you want to do or what your skills are, then find somebody else to do it. Don't overpromise and underdeliver. That's a big problem in all global health and emergency programs. Don't go home too soon or stay too long. I've done both of those. I've gone home too soon because of the pressures to get back to the NHS. You've got a team, people have different pressures on them. I've been in teams where people have said, oh yes, I have got permission to be away for 6 weeks. No, they hadn't, and then they're under pressure to go back. And to keep the team together, everyone got it. You know, I have gone home too soon, and I regret that, and I've tried to correct that as we've developed. And I've stayed on too long, probably stayed on too long in Kosovo, and it became quite hostile towards external people being there. Don't assume you know best. Most practice you see in other countries is different. It might not be better or worse, but there's a great tendency if it's different to think it must be worse or it might be better, and it's not. Don't be a poor or ungrateful guest. When I was in Haiti, there was an international team in the Haitian hospital. They just took it over, and the poor Haitian doctors were in one room in the corner, afraid, just not involved at all in their own hospital, quite isolated because it had just been taken over. Don't be a poor guest. Work with the local infrastructure. Collaborate. Don't compete. Don't leave without saying goodbye. Make sure there is follow-up for your patients. You need your exit plan. Whatever you're doing, if it's a planned visit, whatever you're doing, you need to know what's going to happen after you've gone. And general in leadership, I've found that you need to be credible, you need to be visible, you need to be approachable, and you need to be collaborative, you need to be inclusive. That you will get your team to work with you. You need to practice what you preach, otherwise you're not credible. And only ask people to do what you would do. Don't put people in harm's way if you're not prepared to also share that risk with them. You're not one of the gang. You might want to be, but you're not. People will look to you to make decisions they don't want to take. You've got to get people to follow you, so it's an enormous responsibility. I've always felt that You give talks, people get very enthused by it, but I know that they'll come forwards and volunteer and they will be put in harm's way. That's a big responsibility and I'm very conscious of it. So I have to make sure that everything is in place to protect them as best as you can. But you want to end up with them walking alongside you. They will follow you, but you don't want that. You want them with you. So it helps if you let them know you're going somewhere where they want to go. So explain exactly what it is that you are going to do. When you're actually in uncertainty and things are changing, just some tips. Say what you know and what you don't know. People think you, as a leader, you always have special knowledge about things. And that if you're not sharing it, you're not saying anything, it's because you're keeping it from them. So say what you know and say, I don't know this. Update everybody daily and at a fixed time, even if nothing changes. So as people know, even if it's just everything is normal. It's the same with updating family members back at home. Make sure that they're all updated. You don't want this, that people thinking you've got secrets that can only be shared with the grown-ups. If you can't reveal something, say so. I have been in situations where it's been highly sensitive information they've only shared with you on the understanding you won't share it. So tell people that's why I can't share it with you for now. But don't duck the difficult decisions. Don't take them lightly and discuss with peers. I remember a very difficult triage decision once about the order in which we should take patients for surgery. Some we thought would die in spite of surgery, some we thought would. And we had a whole discussion about it and decided that we were going to triage out 4 patients from treatment. I don't know if you've ever done it, but the first time you do it for real, it is horrible, but we did that. But I said, we are all agreed then, are we? And the team turned to me and said, you're the leader, you decide. And so it is a big responsibility. We operated on all the people who we thought would survive, and they all survived, and those 4 people did perish. So my final thoughts about leadership in whatever capacity, you've got to take people with you. People will follow you, but I don't go in for the macho leadership. I think be a shepherd rather than the leader of a cavalry charge. Thank you.
I will start out just by saying I was not a global health person. I started doing, quote, global health work 10 years ago when I had the opportunity to go to the first emergency medicine residency program in Tanzania, which had started in 2010. And my department was one of a consortium of departments from the US where we were sending faculty for a month or 2 to supervise clinical care. And I was like, what am I going to be able to give? I've never worked in this situation. I know CAT scans and blood gases and all this stuff, but how am I going to manage it in this country? But it turned out there were some basic skills that people needed, and I was able to help with those. And in addition to the clinical supervision, I wound up helping them do research. So I'll talk a little bit about how we went about doing that and how I wound up basically going back every year for a couple of months, COVID accepted, where I did, for anyone who still has their boxes, remote global health work. So where I have been helping them do research projects. So I am the professor of emergency medicine at University of California. I am the editor of the Emergency Medicine Journal, following Tony, and I'm also a research mentor at Muhimbili Hospital in Tanzania. So what my title is how to do high impact and low cost research, which is often what you need to do in low and middle income countries, unless you are one of the lucky people here who have gotten involved with a major foundation or granting organization. And what I've been doing has been not that kind of grant funded work. Most of the work I've been doing is helping people in in this emergency medicine program, there are also other places in Tanzania who just want to do research and are trying to figure out how to do it to advance their specialty and advance their knowledge. So what makes for high impact research? You have to have an important question, you have to have a literature gap, and you need methods that minimize bias. Now, you'll notice there is no bag of money and there is no RCT. Okay, you don't need those things to do impactful research. Now, at the risk of hopefully not insulting anyone who has done this work, right now, the focus of most research in limited income countries, certainly by funders, is malaria, TB, HIV/AIDS, and probably disaster, okay? But where is the need now? And this is where I think we, as emergency physicians, really come in. Because we now are seeing in these countries the rise of non-communicable diseases, which are overtaking infectious diseases. And with them, those are things like hypertension, diabetes, and cancer. And with them come the associated emergencies, hypertensive crises. At Muhimbili, where I work, once a week at least, there would be a hypertensive crisis, maybe more than once. We see renal failure in young people. And we see DKA, a lot of DKA, both in type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Right now, 70% of strokes occur in limited middle income countries, and 87% of disability life years are occurring in these countries as well. And much of this is due to uncontrolled hypertension, and much of that is due to the lack, basically, of good primary care. Because many, as anyone who visited, particularly whether you visited in disaster times or not, know that the primary health care is not so great in many countries. In limited income countries, we've seen a doubling of stroke over the last 4 decades, while we've seen it almost halved in the Western world. The age of people having strokes is at least 15 years younger than in our countries, which has a devastating impact on the economics there. And it also turns out that even though you'll read in the textbook that about 80% of strokes are ischemic, and that may be what we're seeing in our emergency departments, that's not the case in many limited income countries because of the etiology of these strokes. So that's one of the other things we have to tackle. And then, as I mentioned, there's trauma. Okay, now trauma right now is 90% of injuries occur in limited and middle income countries. And that, in fact, there's only about 2% of all funding goes to trauma care in these countries, whereas much of it is still going to infectious disease. So there's an area there that needs a lot of attention. Related to that, but not just to trauma, is the fact that many countries don't have pre-hospital care systems. Or if they do, they're kind of basic, many of them. This is a couple of pictures from Tanzania. On the left, there's somebody who's at an accident being brought to the hospital in a 3-wheeled vehicle called a Bajaj, which is driven by a private little Bajaji driver. And on the right is a patient being brought to the Arusha Lutheran Medical Center on a boda, on a motorcycle, which happens to be equipped with kindly an umbrella for the sun or the rain. So there are lots of areas of challenges. So if you're looking for an important question, there's plenty out there in this world. Now, what about the literature gap? Okay, well, basically all of this is pretty new. And emergency medicine, we have been teaching more or less in the Western model. But we don't know if that really works. Okay, this is a different population. Their illness manifestations are different. The underlying diseases are different. The comorbidities are taking different kinds of tolls than they might in countries where there's better primary care. And they have less resources to deal with these things. And there actually isn't a lot of evidence that the etiologies and management of disease should be the same in different kind of settings than where all that research was originally done, which was here in England and in the US and in Australia and Canada largely. And we learned that lesson with the FEAST trial. If any of you have not heard about it, basically this was a trial looking at the whether fluids in sepsis was beneficial to children in Africa. And they actually found in this study that kids who got a bolus of either saline or albumin did not do as well as children who got no bolus fluids. And this actually, although it was a surprise, actually now I think has come back to our teaching about learning that maybe we shouldn't be giving quite so many fluids. Maybe we should be starting vasopressors earlier. So we actually have a two-way street here. So that was one lesson, I think, where people went, whoa, like what works here doesn't always work there. This on the left is a blood gas that's typical of DKA patients at Mohambili. I don't know if any of you can read it, but the pH is 6.86. Now, I've seen a lot of DKA. I've been working for over 30 years. I have never seen in my department a patient with DKA with a 6.86. How many of you have seen that in your departments? One. Okay. So if you're talking about a place that needs to study whether bicarb works, right? Because all we ever say about bicarb, if the pH is less than 7, go ahead, maybe give it. But we don't have good evidence. This would be a great place to study the issue of bicarb. But that's the kind of illness we're seeing. And so a lot of what we are taught may or may not work in this situation. The other thing you'll see on the right there is a blood gas of another DKA patient. It's not quite so bad, only 7.12 for pH, but you can see the underline that they are hypokalemic. And hypokalemia is something we're always told to worry about in DKA, but most of the time when we do a test on someone coming in, their potassium is normal or high because of their acidosis. There was a study that was done in New York that showed that only 5.6% of patients had hypokalemia and none of them required potassium replacement. And they said, oh, this is really not such a big deal. And the answer is, yeah, maybe in New York it's not a big deal, but this is a chronic issue, a big issue in Tanzania where people aren't being able to get insulin for a couple of hours at least before they can get their potassium repleted. So a different disease, perhaps not exactly, but certainly different manifestation. So that's there. Okay, then there's also the EMS issue. So we think, well, we could just pick up, they can learn EMS, they can do EMS the way we do EMS, right? Ground ambulances, occasionally a helicopter, not so fast. I mean, this is the model, but it's pretty hard to do ground ambulances right in Tanzania. The bottom is a picture of the traffic on a typical day between about 10 in the morning and 7 p.m. at night on the main road that goes through Dar es Salaam. There's basically one big road that goes from the airport into town. That's the traffic. Imagine an ambulance trying to get through that. Above is the classic example of what the roads look like after it rains. They're really not just, this is not a puddle, this is a big pothole that is filled with water, and you can see that the bus stopped because it didn't think it could go into that. So imagine an ambulance trying to pass that. So we have to, I don't have an answer, I'm just saying that we can't just say, let's pick up our ambulance service and take it over there, because the model is not necessarily going to work. So what do we need research for in limited income countries? We need to evaluate the care of this very new specialty called emergency medicine, which has only been around in most places are about 10 to 15 years, and only in a few places in many of these countries. We need to also do research to demonstrate the need for changes and improvements in that care. We need to develop context-appropriate solutions. And we also need to direct funding to where now the problems are, and our research can actually point that out. So I'm just going to show you a couple examples of the type of things that my residents have largely done at Muhimbili, and then I'll tell you how much these cost. So this was a typical study that we all do in emergency medicine, which was, how well do we treat pain? And everybody knows no emergency department treats pain well, right? So this is an old question, but it's a new question in Tanzania where emergency medicine is new, right? No one studied this before because they're not paying much attention to pain. They just need to get the basics, they just want to get the basics right. So we did this study on pain management and not surprisingly found that less than 50% of trauma patients receive pain medication in the ED. And that's Dr. Delunga, and he's opening his new department in Dodoma literally the year after he graduated and did this as his dissertation. So you can see that that points to the need, and that actually emergency medicine, like here, has things it needs to fix. Now, speaking about different populations and different diseases, one of the other residents did a study on the APLS formula and the Braslow tape to see whether or not that worked in estimating the weight of children seen in this Muhimbili emergency department. And not surprisingly, they didn't. Okay, the Braslow tape and the APLS both overestimated the child's weight, which would have resulted in overdosing the child with whatever medication you were going to give. And the physician gestalt, which was great that they actually tested, was actually underestimating. And they did this very simply. Basically, every child that came in was weighed on a simple scale, nurse wrote down, and they measured them against the Braslow tape and calculated the APLS formula for each one. Not a lot of expense to do this. And yet this was a very important finding that I think now a lot of us are questioning which of these we should be using. This is a study by Nanyori Lukame. She's visiting me here in this picture in San Francisco. And she did a study on pre-referral stabilization of injured patients that are referred to Muhimbili, which is a tertiary hospital. Now, in Tanzania, as in many places, there are various levels of healthcare. And there's the health centers, which are very basic, and then there's the community health centers, and then there are the regional health centers, and then regional hospitals, and then ultimately there are a few tertiary hospitals. And pretty much people get taken to any one of those hospitals when they're injured. There's no network, there's no trauma network. And then they get, if needed, they get referred on to Muhimbili as the trauma center. And so they had noticed, her department had noticed that the notes that were coming with these people on what was being done for them was very, very poor. No C-spine collars, they don't have C-spine collars, no sheets around people's necks. Everybody came, by the way, with a catheter. Everybody had a urinary catheter. But no, and maybe an IV, but no C-spine, no immobilization of limbs that was appropriate, and so on and so forth. So she basically looked at what was done pre-referral using the notes and what the patient looked like, compared it to the WHO checklist of what should be done before you refer a patient, and found that most patients were not sufficiently stabilized before coming to Muhimbili, which suggests the need, as we've seen earlier, that we need to teach people in these other hospitals how to do this work. There can't all be emergency physicians, but they can be trained to do this kind of stabilization. The other interesting thing was that the most basic hospitals or medical centers in Tanzania actually did the best job. They did a better job than the fancy regional hospitals. So that also says something about education and resources. You don't need tons of resources, you just need to know what you're doing. By the way, this paper, I meant to mention the other one, has already been cited 14 times, and it's been out about 3 years. So these are not, as I said, these are high impact studies. Now, this is one, unfortunately, was not published. I've been after this resident for years to do this. He did a randomized control trial in the department during his residency, comparing sub-Q insulin to IV insulin, just regular sub-Q insulin, not the fancy ones, just regular, and found it was equally effective. And that could be a huge benefit in a place where IVs are expensive, pumps don't exist, and even, insulin itself is expensive. So the ability to give sub-Q insulin, which you could do almost immediately, would be phenomenal. Unfortunately, he didn't publish it, but you can see that what an impact that could have had. And he did it as a resident with minimal budget. And then finally, this is, there's a group of people, but the woman in front is Masuma. Masuma loves a picture. And she published this study on the emergency department, the out-of-pocket costs for trauma patients who were seen at Muhimbili, and found that 87% of patients who were hospitalized with trauma had what was called a catastrophic healthcare expense. They spent more than a quarter of their monthly income for that injury and still left the hospital owing about half their bill. And many of them had to do what's called distress financing, which is where they had to borrow from a family member, sold land, sold cattle, just to pay the bill, and then still owed money. And so this is the kind of study, and by the way, this was in BMJ Open, that could eventually have some impact on how this country, maybe others, go about financing healthcare for its largely poor population. So you can see how this study, again, done by essentially one person, although with some help, could be done, and again, not terribly costly. Okay, so what did I just show you? I don't know. I think I have two there. I don't know why there's two of them. Okay, there we go. Now, all of these were done for less than 500 pounds. They collected data for 3 to 4 months, and they, from IRB to approval, for those who actually managed to do a manuscript, was less than 2 years. So I think these are good, high impact studies telling us a lot about what's going on in this country. And I think, as you can see, it did not cost a lot of money. So now, how do you do a study well when you only have 500 pounds? And the answer is you do it, you can do it, and you can do it well. So first of all, what we really need are observational studies. Don't need RCTs right now. We need people to understand what's going on, what are the priorities in healthcare, and particularly in emergency medicine in these countries. Now, if you want to see if you can do something with an improvement, then maybe take advantage of a change that's going on in the hospital and do a before and after study. Not RCT, which is hard and complicated, but a before and after study. Take advantage of what's going on in these changes. And another, I didn't show this, but one of our other residents, now faculty, did a study, quasi-experimental study, where she was trying a new kind of CPAP machine on babies. She didn't want to randomize it, but we knew that there would be times that that machine wouldn't be available. So, and that was on a very random basis. So she took advantage of the fact that we just don't have the resources to give that to everybody. So she was able to compare the kids that got the machine and didn't get the machine in a totally ethical way. Capitalize on existing data processes or make data collection part of clinical care. This sheet on the right is a data collection form for trauma, which was started years and years ago at Muhimbili Hospital. Actually was in a giant book about this big with NCR paper, so there was a copy. And the physicians used this for documenting clinically trauma cases, and it led them nicely through what they needed to collect and what they should be doing. And so it served as their clinical documentation, and then they were done. They took it apart. One copy went with the chart. The other one went to a person doing data upload and created a database. And so they have now about a 10-year trauma registry for that hospital. And since then, it's been expanded to 5 other regional hospitals doing it this way, making the clinical work the same as the research work. If you can't do that, then at least if you have to have research assistants, make the concepts that you're trying to collect simple. Don't ask them to make judgments or score things or whatever. Just make a simple case report form and you can do the math later, so that nursing students and medical students can do the data collection for you and charge fairly little for being a research assistant. Now, we often think about chart review as a great inexpensive way to do a first study, but actually I would say it's better to do prospective studies if you can, because there's a lot of missing data in many places right now. And so your validity would be much greater. And you can, as I said in the last slide, showed you ways you can do a valid prospective study without much cost. You don't have to collect 24/7. You do, however, have to collect data on a representative basis, scheduled basis, with certain shifts always being represented. Make sure you've done a sample size calculation so you know that this study is feasible with the amount of time and money you have. You can still blind people in observational studies to blind the statisticians to the hypothesis, and those assessing the outcomes can be blinded to the variables of interest. So those are all still good methods that can be followed in an inexpensive study. And I also have encouraged my mentees, avoid outcomes that require adjudication where you need a panel of people to make a decision, or someone's going to complain because you had an emergency physician read the ECG instead of a cardiologist. So think about ways you can do things if you can involve someone else, great, but otherwise try to make the really clear-cut outcomes. And then lastly, I just want to talk about ethics. So my approach, and I would have to say that one of my fears at the beginning of entering into global health has been that it has felt honestly a little imperialistic to me, that we have gone in and said to people, here's what you have to do, here's how you had to practice, here is the research I would like to do, will you help me with it? And I think our job is to help people there learn to do research and then do the research on what they want to do it on. So you've all heard this quote, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach him how to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. And that is really what I try to do when I'm working with my mentees in Tanzania and elsewhere. So allow the investigators in the country to choose the topic. You may have to help them make it feasible, but let them decide what's needed. You can see none of those studies, by the way, was done on malaria, TB, or anything. They were all done on non-communicable diseases and trauma. And that's what the residents picked to do. Engage local collaborators on their end so you can teach others the work at the same time. I provide guidance, provide a lot of autonomy, but stick with it and help them get to the end so that they can see the finished work, the value, and what they've learned. Nothing is better than seeing my residents who started off with a blank piece of paper coming with their dissertation, as I showed you with that book with Ishmael, from having known very little about research to having actually gotten a dissertation done. Avoid one-off projects that rely on you. You cannot always be there. You may not be able to return. So don't pick a topic where the expert comes and helps people do something and see now, oh, that's feasible now in this department, because then the expert leaves. So they should be things that are sustainable. And do not be the first author. Be the second author, be the third author, be the senior author, but don't be the first author. And that's pretty much what I have to say. So mainly I want to point out that almost any project in a limited middle income country will be novel and important. Descriptive, observational, prospective studies are needed. Design them for feasibility and ability to complete them. Rigorous methods cost no more than careless ones. And study what's important to your collaborators. Thank you.
pleasure to be here today, and there's been some fantastic reflections, and particularly around some of the change in language I'm really starting to hear come through. And as we start to sort of unpack that sort of whole power and those asymmetries of power and privilege that we can sit here very comfortably in Edinburgh in the Royal College of Emergency Medicine and Royal College of Surgeons, and talk about what we do in other countries, and how we need to shape that and change some of that sort of going forward. Some of that I'll thread throughout the presentation. So the Global Health Partnership team at Health Education England recently merged over to NHS England. So very pleasing to know, good signal today, there is a global health unit at NHS England. I believe we are it. So I'll give you a bit of an overview of our unit. Bit about the NHS Global Fellowship Programme, which touches on a number of different themes today about placements, our healthcare staff from the NHS working abroad, partner countries, our achievements, and a little bit of where we're going in the future. Oops, I've hit the wrong button, haven't I? Next one. Yes, so a few years ago, people may know Jed Byrne from Manchester, who, and Tony, I know you've got a long-term friendship with Jed, has been leading the team, and we set our strategy for global health under the then Health Education England, which of course is very focused on workforce development. And there's 3 different offers, and we look at them from what we do, the offer to the individual, for NHS staff, really looking at those career pathways into the space of global health. What also global health brings back to the NHS in terms of NHS systems and development, innovation, redesign, etc., quality improvement, but also the offer to our global partners and the role that the NHS can play. So amongst this is we have the NHS Global Fellowship Programme, which some people may remember used to be called the Improving Global Health Programme, and it came out of, I think it was Wessex down in the southwest of England, and eventually moved in and has grown. So it's been a 14-year programme, really strong foundations, quite a number of different research projects over that time, and to demonstrate to where we are, and I think really legitimises where we are now and how we can go forward. And we've had the opportunity to recently, through the transition to a new organisation, Fleur, who led the programme for 14 years, took retirement. And so it was a great opportunity through that transition to reset and think about where we're going. And in a nutshell, this is sort of really what we're about, that we offer, and purposely using that word reciprocal, because it's something we want to grow in leadership development opportunities. The whole programme has been framed within the NHS Leadership Academy, leadership development framework, and we've been very good at creating opportunities for NHS staff to go abroad, but we've not been good at receiving healthcare workers from abroad to come and have similar exposure to a totally different health system, different culture, different way of working. And so it's something we really want to work on. And this the same with higher education institutions. Great at sending, you know, how many medical students have done placements abroad, nursing students have done placements abroad, but how many medical and nursing students we receive in this country as part of their training. And there's lots of evidence coming at this. I've seen data from North America of how many placements go abroad from the global north to the global south. But it's not reciprocated in the same way. And yet there's huge labour coming from those countries who receive those partners. And we say, oh, but they're getting something out of it. They're getting expertise. Actually, they labour a lot to induct somebody, you know, make them culturally aware, how to operate, and really it takes months before someone's really hitting the ground and running. Creating opportunities for clinical, non-clinical staff. For instance, we've got a commissioner who's going down to Uganda in the coming months. But we had physios, OTs, nurses, doctors, focusing on when they go abroad. They're generally not, the program that I overlook has 3 different areas, or 3 that we commission looks at quality improvement projects, research projects, and then we have a clinical project, and that's run out of the old East of England regional team. And we commission 25 doctors who do clinical placements abroad. But the team that I overlook looks at the quality improvement and research partnerships. Again, another word, key to co-development, and it's something we've talked about today. A true partnership is not one where we go and say, well, this is what we want to do, and come along and sign the papers, and then I'll write a paper out of it and publish it in a journal in the UK. You know, really embedding those sort of all those the ACRA Paris agreements, etc., that embed that concept of co-development and ownership at local level. So working with our partners to understand, well, what outcomes do you want to achieve from this? And ultimately, and I say to our team, if we can't retain the focus on enhancing the patient experience, improving health outcomes and reducing health inequalities, we should all go home now. This is not just about career development. It's not just about giving you a break from the NHS. It's about, there's elements of that, but we can't lose sight of, ultimately, we're here in the NHS, and the same in global health. We should retain that focus on what it means that, as the end users of our services in this country and abroad. We've got a lot of evidence over those 14 years that our returning fellows demonstrate new skills, particularly leadership development skills. And we've also got some evidence. Plymouth did a piece of research that we commissioned, and they did some learning action sets that people who've worked in other countries coming back and are using those skills, sometimes don't even know they've got those skills, and they're actually applying them here in the NHS. But also, we do see a lot of that motivation and the resilience. And critically, this is my big pitch, is that this leads to career progression and it does retain staff. People generally come back to the NHS, which is a good thing to talk to our seniors about. If you work in the global space, if you work for an ODA funded program, we need to have a theory of change. Interestingly, it's something that our donors, like the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, impose on other countries. Theory of change. How many people have done a theory of change when you set up a community intervention in the UK? We don't. We go, it'll work, but we actually haven't thought through. So we do have a theory of change, really leveraging this on the concept that in order, if we don't invest in, equitably attracting, developing, including retaining our staff, we won't get a good patient experience. We won't get good patient outcomes. And with the work, the NHS England's long-term workforce plan coming out in the last week, it's a good pitch to our senior management to say this is good for the NHS, this program, and many of the programs in this room. Broadly, as extends from what I just showed you, our activities of creating opportunities for clinical and non-clinical staff, leadership, project management, quality improvement. We need to do better. There's a whole concept that you go abroad and you come back culturally competent. What does culturally competent mean? Who's defined it? Through what lens have we defined that? How are we measuring it? So while we're going out and saying we send someone abroad and they come back culturally competent, there's actually some evidence that suggests that going abroad can, if not managed well, lead to cultural voyeurism, where you come out with an increased coloniality mindset of the poor then. If I wasn't there, this wouldn't have happened. And so you can actually reinforce some of those colonial sort of mindsets. So really thinking that through that sort of decolonial lens is really critical. But you need to be able to support and provide a framework and a space to have those sometimes challenging, confronting conversations. We're providing country support and supervision, and then we have mentors. Many of them are retired doctors and nurses who just want to stay in the space, who bring years of experience, and they use sort of a coaching conversations. Outputs, they do projects, they provide a portfolio of evidence, and ultimately, we like to see that the theory is that they come back and apply those skills, and leads to improved staff retention and career progression, underpinned by a number of assumptions, and some of those have fallen off, unfortunately. And there's things that we need to do better, and some of it is creating those permissive pathways. I was hearing about what's happening at Bristol Royal Infirmary, how doctors are going abroad and they get salaried, but nurses go abroad and they encouraged to take annual leave. Paramedics who are saying, sorry, service demand is too much. Well, ultimately, in a retention crisis, if you don't look after your staff, you will lose loyalty. My experience, I was in Camden for 17 years and went abroad 3 times. And every time my boss rang me, I'd pick up the phone. Yes, Nikki. She bought my loyalty because she gave me the opportunity to flex and go abroad. And I do know of nurses who, incredible A&E nurses. Spoke to someone a while back. She wanted to go and work for MSF, and I said, "Oh, you'll come back here." She said, "Oh no, they've told me it's too difficult to backfill me." She said, "I'll go to Whitechapel." So I'm coming back here. I thought, my God, you have just lost an incredible A&E nurse. Very foolish. Performance indicators, we've got a range of performance indicators which we're refining. So being able to measure this and demonstrate this, again, to justify the resource, the NHS money that the pot money that I have to use. Our partner countries, we've done a bit of a consolidation program at the moment, and we are looking at scaling up into countries. And again, countries where we actually have, I believe, a moral obligation. If we look at nursing, for instance, being a nurse, I'm always about for nurses, but in 2021, nearly 10,000 nurses joined the Nursing Midwifery Council from India. Nearly 6,000 came from India. The latest data of registrations, 50% of new nursing registrants in this country come from abroad. I haven't got the breakdown of those countries, but India and the Philippines is significant. We have we've got a leadership development program here. We have 22,000 Filipino nurses working in the NHS. At band 8B and above, through the ESR data, there's 50. Okay, we've failed this group of nurses who have given up their families, given up their homes, given up their friends to live here. Really love working here, appreciate the experience, but where's the leadership development? I could talk a lot about that. So we are looking at where we should be scaling up and where we need to do better. In terms of, maybe this is a bit small, but you can see just the spread of countries. We've done quite a lot of work in South Africa. We've had a long-term relationship in Cambodia, which is just coming to a close. And we've got a big program in Uganda. In terms of what people say, a lot of it comes from our fellows. Again, that whole concept of really being exposed to being dropped in the deep end, totally new health system, different country, different culture, different language, different team, and really having to think differently and being exposed to that. And coming back with not only personal, but also professional development in that. A GP recently emailed me saying she's become an executive partner. She said, it wasn't for your program. She said, I really believe some of my leadership skills that I have now have come from me being abroad and taking that plunge, and now I'm stepping up. One of our country partners has talked about the legacy of the projects that we've been involved in. I very much like to talk about collaboration. I don't like to talk too much about technical aid or technical assistance. I'm really trying to move this to, again, this concept of partnership and creating some level of equity in that. Again, another quote, giving experience in complex problem solving, navigating difficult discussions, diverse individuals and teams to sensibly, systematically challenge current ways of thinking and working. So in terms of sort of going forward, we've currently got 32 fellows abroad, and 5 of those are abroad for 12 months in Thailand. We've got a partnership with the medical school, the Thai consortium of medical schools, and there's 2 quite prestigious universities, Mahidol and Chulalongkorn, and they go there for 12 months to do a research project, and then Thai doctors are coming to the UK. I think one's in Leeds. The big challenge is English proficiency and getting the OETS, getting them across the line for that, and there's a further 4 to come. They'll come and do the 3-year training program. They get slotted into where there's opportunities there, and the Thai government have tied them in to go back and then go back into clinical jobs back in Thailand. So it's not about long-term recruitment, although the NHS, again, gets a pair of hands for those 3 years. We've got 21 starting in August. We've got another 22 we're just appointing for February. It takes about 6 months leading because people have to, sometimes people have to resign. They have to sort out their tenancies and rental agreements. So they've got to lead in. And as I said, we're planning to scale up in 3 new countries. Had conversation. We generally work with colleagues at the British Embassy through Post, who are very good at sort of being on that side, sort of opening up doors and building relationships through that. Big plug. We've got a program in Uganda. Knows a number of partners here in Uganda. There's a diagnostic imagery program, and the permanent secretary at Tweenie, she wrote to us the other day and said, you do know we've got 14 new CT scanners. We've been working in Gulu for a number of years, and they're really keen. They bought 14 new CT scanners, and yet they don't have the workforce skilled at that level to operate the CT scanners. So if anyone's interested, it's not just about operating CT scanner, it's about care pathways into CT, care pathways after CT. And the other big thing that we're really moving forward is engaging in, and I find that a funny word, you know, that we talk about diaspora communities. You think, well, have a think, what does that mean in your head and who are we referring to? I actually came from Australia. I have never been referred to a diaspora community. Often we're talking about the other people from Africa or from another country. And again, what's that laden with? So I'm really trying to encourage, and we're pleased that we've got 2 Ugandan or 2 healthcare workers with Ugandan heritage. One's a doctor who trained in Uganda and a commissioner going down there to work there. And similarly, we've already tapped into the Filipino nurses community, the Indian Nurses Association, to sort of engage those healthcare workers here who have the skills, who would love to go back to their home countries and do something. So I'll finish that. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for bearing with us for so long. It's been a great day. I'll start with my personal journey with trauma. There he is, his name's Gypsy. I love him dearly, but horse riding has broken many of my bones. And being in the UK, I recognise that there's a brilliant trauma service that comes and scoops me off the ground when I fall off my horse. However, in the other countries that I work, predominantly diabetes and endocrinology and also surgery, there are no such systems. I'm a researcher, but also I'm interested in only doing research that counts, that fills gaps. So when I think about doing global health research, I like to know what we know and what we don't know, and then I like to fill those gaps. So I'm going to just take you on a little bit of a journey, the journey that I've had anyway. Once I got off the horse and had various broken bones repaired, to discover what the known and unknown knowns were with trauma. As we've already heard from Ellen, until 2015, nobody seemed to care about trauma, NCDs, surgery. Weren't in the MDGs at all. And they've only marginally made it into the Sustainable Development Goals too. There's only one of them on trauma, none of them on surgery, by the way. But injury care, unlike those MDG goals, actually needs a complex health system. So if you're injured, you need to have a complex health system. This is essentially the WHO building blocks that we all know. They're multiple and they're interacting. Not only is this a complex system when you reach it, trying to get to it, to access it, has its own complexities. And before you even think about getting to care, you've got to think about the whole aspect of quality of the care that you're getting. You can get to care, is it of high quality? So this is an absolutely difficult problem to solve, and certain people have called it a wicked problem, and that's why I do global health. I get really bored. You've heard that I've had lots of careers. I've had lots of careers because I get really bored really easily. This one has kept me going for a very long time because it's so difficult. Firstly, you're doing something very valuable, or I feel I'm doing something very valuable, and also it's really interesting. So wicked problems are by their very nature complex and difficult to solve. So health systems in general, a complex health system for injury, are very complex. And as I've already alluded to, then it's not just the health system, it's accessing it and it's making sure that health system is of high quality. Well, if you want to look at access, it's a whole domain in itself, multiple different components of access, which I've only outlined 4 there, right? But they're again multiple and interacting, very difficult to solve on their own. Geography, availability, the costs of getting to care, the culture of people, and their own cultural interactions. So in some countries where I work, Sierra Leone being one, you can't have an operation as a woman without a man signing the consent form. You know, there are difficulties in access that we can't even begin to comprehend. Quality, again, defining quality of care is really difficult, but the Institute of Medicine have tried to do so. And so you've got these domains of quality. So you put it all together, you've got the WHO building blocks, you've got quality, you've got access, and you've got a wicked problem. So this is nicked from maternal health care, and it's one of the ways that we have tried to disentangle access to quality trauma care, and this is using a 4 delays framework. And it's, you'll all know, it's seeking, reaching, receiving and remaining in quality care. And it's a model that we have found really useful to break down some of those complexities and understand what's going wrong and where the gaps are. We do know some stuff. Most of you are focusing, I think, in EDs. You work in hospitals. And I'm a skeptic. And so when I started this work a while ago, 2017, I wanted to understand where the problems were. And I understood that most people focus on, is quality of care provided in the hospital? But what we did is we took this 4 delays model and applied it to people who we knew had died due to trauma. And we asked where in those 4 delays they had, that there was avoidable mortality. And what we found was that, this is in South Africa, that about 40% of injury deaths in South Africa are avoidable. And of these, about 60% occur in the facility, which is great, which is where most of you work. But actually that leaves 40% that occur because people aren't seeking care or people aren't reaching care. That's still a massive burden of avoidable deaths. Charlie Marketel have actually shown the same in a different way. They've done modelling, which shows that about 40% of all injury deaths could be averted if case facility in LMICs matched high-income countries. But you know this, hey? You're thinking, oh my God, shoot me now, do I have to listen to this woman for any longer? And I didn't do that to my cats, okay? So we've talked about what we know, but there's also a lot of Rumsfeldian known unknowns. And as Alan said a while ago, there's a lot of research that hasn't been done. So we're all talking about going and providing services, and that's great. But when we go and provide services, as Alan said, are those services actually what are needed? For the most part, we don't know. Sometimes we do, but for the most part, we don't know. So I teamed up with John Whittaker, who was my PhD student. He's in the UK Army, so his PhD was funded by the Army. And we looked at the literature for access to quality care. And most of the studies that are done focus on the facility, right? They focus on delay 3, receiving quality care. There's a little bit of reaching it, pre-hospital care, and a little bit of seeking it, but not very much. The good thing about that is, although it highlights that there's not much done outside the facility, when you map it onto the verbal autopsy results, we found that actually what is done is commensurate with where the fatalities are. So we're happy that, you know, we want to expand research done before the hospital, but also that it's commensurate at the moment. So we need to increase the level of all research. We also then wanted to map in more depth this whole issue of access to care. And so in Rwanda, which is where I work, we got together with stakeholders and we got them to think about these delays, these delay stages, and said, where are you experiencing difficulties? And we got into this chaos again, just in 2 days of workshop, right? We took a 3 or 4 delays framework and we said, where are your barriers? And we found barriers that were financial, we found barriers that were related to health system, we found barriers that were related to infrastructure. We found an awful lot of chaos. And now what we're trying to do with a couple of grants is to try and disentangle that spider's web. So what have we done? We've talked today about health systems and going on missions to places. Heard a lot about that. And one of the things that we developed is a methodology, a framework for studying those health systems that we're going into. And so this is work, again, that we did with the UK Army, because often when the UK Army goes into a country, they use that country's healthcare system to treat their own people. So they're really interested in studying health systems. So what essentially John did is we did a mapping exercise looking at what people had done before. We then developed a complex mixed method way of assessing health systems, but quickly. And I'm just going to share with you a few of the results. We did this in Malawi. The first thing we did is we looked at patterns of healthcare access. So for people who have been injured, and we did this in a couple of ways. We did verbal autopsy data, looked at people who had died, and essentially that involved data collectors going and ask the family what happened to those people before they died. And using the verbal autopsy data, first port of call was primary healthcare. Right, and we also did a household survey of about 22,000 people, and we found exactly the same. The first port of call was usually primary healthcare. And why? We did some geographic information system mapping. Why is it primary healthcare? Well, because it's close. People can't reach secondary healthcare. So about 5% of the population in Malawi, in this place we were studying, could reach a hospital within the golden hour, if you trust the golden hour, or within the Lancet Commission on Surgery's 2-hour target. Right, so only 5% could reach a hospital. And these are people that subsequently died of their injuries. They needed secondary care. And we asked, all right, well, how about readiness of those facilities? So people are going to primary care, and you can see the readiness. These are primary trauma care guidelines. So we actually looked at all of the kits and human resources you would need to treat people if you followed primary care guidelines. And if you look at primary care, then despite the primary guideline that we looked at, only 60% of facilities had those resources to manage them. And it increased with the secondary care facilities to more or less 100%. But don't forget, people can't get there. Then we looked at competency of providers. And this is something that we don't like to talk about, but it's important if you've got a provider treating you that they are competent to provide care. So we developed a vignette tool to ask people about their competencies to certain primary trauma care scenarios. And no one person was 100% competent to deal with quite common trauma scenarios. And this is themselves, their knowledge, or their knowledge of what they should do, but they didn't have the equipment to deliver. So for all primary trauma care scenarios, there was no person that was 100% competent. That's not a criticism of the people at all. It is a criticism of the system. I'm rattling through these, by the way, because I know we want to get to questions for everybody. So we developed that so that we could go and assess health systems holistically to identify the gaps so that we could think of ways to address those gaps. And some of that knowledge of how to address those gaps we might already have, and some of it we don't, in which case we need to do more research to find out that what we're doing is the right thing to do. So we found that actually you can rapidly assess health systems. That whole project, I've only shown you a fraction of it, but it took 3 months, that's all. One researcher and a research team with him took 3 months. We found that there are issues in all dimensions of access to care and quality of care, and that wasn't just at the healthcare facility, although many of the barriers are focused at the healthcare facilities. And getting to healthcare facilities really shouldn't be neglected, because when we're only seeing a fraction of the people that are actually arriving at the healthcare facility. And yes, it's important to provide good care for them, but also with a duty to help people to get to care. So what next? We've got a global health group grant to do the same as we've done in Malawi in 4 countries, Ghana, Pakistan, South Africa and Rwanda, to look at in all of these countries where the gaps are for people who've been injured to get to care. And we're also working with the Rwandan government at the moment to improve their pre-hospital care system, and we're developing some technology to improve ambulance communication. So that's what we're doing, because that was that gap that came out of that workshop. You know, that chaos I showed you, that was the gap that came out of that. So that 15 minutes, 11 seconds. I've talked enough. Thank you very much.
So it's time now for a bit of Q&A. Now, there may be questions that you've had answered throughout the day. There may be things that are burning that you want to address to the speakers. If there's anything on your mind that you'd like to ask, sort of straight off the bat, please stick your hand up really proud and tall so we can see it. And if there's nothing that jumps immediately to mind, just wanted to ask the speakers and anybody else actually in the room, just to think about anything that they wanted to say about any of the stuff that they've heard today, or just general comments about some of the work that might have made them think differently, or even about this whole area of emergency medicine and global health in the UK and how we might take things forward. So have a moment to just think if there's anything you'd like to share. And I think it's really important actually that if there's something you want to say, that you do. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what you think. Say something really controversial if you really want to. Just the back.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I'm going to be doing rural GP training in August. So with that in mind, I was kind of wondering for all the speakers today, we've sort of spoken about how lots of it is to do with access to secondary care or tertiary care. And with Ellen's talk, we spoke about how a lot of the things that you're seeing now are more non-communicable diseases that you would see in primary care. So I was sort of wondering, do you think there needs to be more of a shift to teaching more primary care, or to equipping more of these primary care settings with the ability to deal with emergencies?
It's difficult, isn't it? So primary care in many of the countries that I work in predominantly deals with infectious diseases and MNCH, maternal neonatal child health. Should we equip primary care to deal with complex trauma, given that that would take a massive upskilling? Or should we actually look at whether it's possible to invest in getting good EMS services to get people to the facility that they need to? Or should we actually think about having better communication with people so that they know that really they shouldn't go straight to primary care, they should go straight to the hospital? So my answer to your question is I would be quite reluctant to focus on upskilling in primary care, but I actually don't know the answer because I don't think anybody's ever tested.
Hi, I think that's a great question. And I'll just say that as much as I love emergency medicine, I feel that sometimes I feel that funding to primary care in some of these places. One time when I was staying in Tanzania, I lived 10 minutes from the hospital, and I would walk down the street, and there would be this zebra crossing, right, that nobody would stop at. and it would get to this intersection of where there was no lights or anything. And so I was trying to get to work, and I had now been at Mohimbili a few weeks, and I'd seen all the strokes and the renal failure in young people. And I said, okay, one day I'm going to come out here with a sign, and I'm going to stand in the zebra crossing to make people stop. And then I'm going to take all their blood pressures and give everybody medicine, because I really do feel a lot of the emergencies we're seeing are, I don't know how all of them can be prevented, but I think a lot of them could be prevented if the concept even of, I mean, in many places, the concept doesn't really exist. People go when they don't feel well. So there's a kind of a two-way street here, which is, even if if you build it, will they come? So I do think, though, that a lot of times I feel like money should be spent there and on infrastructure, on the roads, on the water. All these things that are bringing kids with diarrheal disease, if we fix that, my guess is it's probably in the long run more cost effective. But the fact is right now, and this is what everybody says, and I have to kind of agree with them, what we're seeing is emergencies are happening, and we have to be there to take care of it.
Thanks. Just a word of caution, really. I found that primary care, the phrase and what it means, it varies from what we might consider a specialism or specialty and family medicine to just the first care that you get. It's not a phrase I found and so that can be difficult when dealing with governments or populations about we think you should have primary care. And secondly, hospitals are a huge magnet for people. You can talk about we must invest in primary care while they're all walking past you going to the hospital. And politicians want to invest in hospitals. And Taj was talking about people, donors want to build a hospital because it's a monument. It's not defeatist, it's just realistic, and I think you have to accept that. But clearly, the more you can move healthcare towards prevention and towards closer to people's homes, the better, and then that reduces the problems of access. But it's complicated. Thanks.
Thank you. Hey, I'm Jade. I'm an F1 working in Birmingham. I just had a question for Kevin. Just following on from what Ellen and Tony said, is there much of a space for or focus on preventative medicine in the fellowships currently, or any thoughts to pursue that? I just think you mentioned a few times about the kind of intention to be anti-imperial, and I think there's a huge mandate for that in terms of preventative medicine. I was in South Africa for a few years, and the rise of diabetes and uncontrolled hypertension because of the importation of Western junk food and the kind of associating that with wealth and success is so tragic when there's so much Indigenous knowledge about how to be healthy and not suffer with those conditions.
Yeah, thanks for the question. All of the quality improvement projects are directed from the hospital, and some of them, do go into those spaces. They might be auditing something. Even more recently, we've had a call for some net zero planetary health type stuff. So I think we had a nurse went down, was and they asked about waste management, and something she got involved in and came back to the NHS and became a waste management champion at her own trust. So again, skills development building and the transferability of back here, so it's really guided by that. But similarly, the research projects that are happening in Thailand, yes, some of them are around prevention, public health, that was framed as a public health research partnerships. One's doing some stuff on AI, machine learning, and prevention of renal chronic kidney disease. So probiotic work. So there's quite a range of different things happening.
There's another question.
Hi, I'm Alex. This is a question really to all of our speakers, and we've talked quite a lot about data and sort of research opportunities. And as somebody who really believes in kind of the power of stories and also in collaboration with these communities, is there a role for qualitative research in global health?
Everyone's going to answer this one.
But of course. I'm a very, very quantitative researcher. I like my answer to come in the form of a number, preferably with no decimal points and a p-value that's significant. But we do mixed methods research because your number can only get you so far. So you have to actually understand why that number is as it is, because only then can you start to address it. So yeah, I would say so.
HCRI is a cross-faculty institute between humanities and medicine, and one of the most important pieces of work we've done is reviewing patients after the Haiti earthquake, where we did a mixed method. So there was data about what the surgery was done, but there was a qualitative aspect to the research that interviewed survivors and talked to them about their experiences. A piece of qualitative research, which the combination of the quantitative and the qualitative had a very high impact. So absolutely yes.
Just to add a couple of points, I think that it's a great question, and absolutely the power of story is quite incredible. So I would support the sort of thesis that we need more qualitative research. Two additional points I suppose I would make is the power of story, especially with the media, is really incredible. So when we're trying to influence the public in some of these low middle income countries, connecting to the media and actually telling a story will be probably a far more powerful public health message than if you can pitch that right. And then to be able to research that, I think is a really good paradigm to explore. The other thing which I was really taken by a group I think I was talking about in the workshop called Child Life in Karachi, and they've got a very inspirational chief exec, but their medical director is also incredibly inspirational, and he talks about stories to his staff, and they follow up a group of their patients by ringing them and saying, what was your experience like with us? And so they have about a 5-10% ratio of people who want to complain. They were really quite amazed that they did ring, and so he then plays those stories back to his staff, and they're usually because they were busy, because they didn't have enough time, all the things that we might be faced with. But of course they're scaled up by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4. So actually these are really different and innovative ways of looking at stories, both how staff react, but actually the power of including a very powerful medium like the media, when in fact really we're all driven by publication, which perhaps was where your question might have started from. So, but it's a really important point. Thank you.
One question with Claire. We might make this the last question, but for all of you joining us at Bonnie and Wild afterwards, you can carry on asking your questions. And even if the speakers aren't there, we promise to get them to them. Claire.
Hi, Anisa, you asked for a controversial question?
I mean, if you want.
So we've talked quite a bit today about kind of increasing involvement in global health work and addressing barriers. I think the controversial question is, are we doing enough to ensure the right people are involved in research quality improvement and clinical work overseas?
Can you expand a little bit more on the right people, Claire?
I was hoping that the speakers might. Are the people in this room, are we the right people? We do a lot to address, you and I, Anisa, are doing some work to look at barriers to addressing global health involvement, and we've heard some other people in the room doing similar things. Sometimes I feel like a question, the elephant in the room is, are we the right people? Who are the right people? And what are we doing to research or address or ask that question?
So I think that's actually an impossible question to answer. We can sometimes definitely say that we're not the right person, but I think it's absolutely impossible to say, yes, we are the right person, because I think many of us bring different skills. We all bring enthusiasm, and that's great. And many of us bring different skills, and we'll fail sometimes when we're faced with a challenge, and we'll succeed with another. So I don't think that any of us are 100% the right person, but I think some domains of our characteristics means in certain places, and hopefully more than 50%, we are.
I think we're probably the right people for now. And I think with most innovations, people have to say we are we think we're the right people for now because we're doing it, but be open to the fact that other people will come along as we expand it, who will point out that we're probably not the right people or no longer the right people, and be willing to adapt and change. But particularly with global health and international emergency, we have to involve the people to whom we are going into their country, and so they will be the core right people. And then in my ideal world, they will be deciding who amongst us are the right people. But I think it's the right thing to ask, and I think we've just got to be bold enough to say we're probably the right people for now, but maybe not forever.
While Taj is getting the microphone, I think it's a great question. I would say you want to bring something to the table. We know we all want to go there and learn, okay, and that's great. But unless that is a place that's set up specifically for that reason, then you need to come with something, and that could be in just enthusiasm. I think it really helps to have a skill. I have right now in my department a lot of people who want to go and educate, and there's a lot of educators out there, right? So I think that's one thing that might argue for going a little bit later in your career, going when you have some of these qualities, or a good idea and have studied it a while. But I think if you have the enthusiasm, if you have the curiosity, and you're willing to do the work, then yes, you're the right person.
It's a great question again. So I think it's a bit of what Ellen said. I think there are three domains for me in terms of the stuff that I've become involved in. So there's education training. You say, oh, that's what I want to do. I want to be connected and help. There's direct clinical care. You want to go. I haven't been fortunate enough to do that. And there's advocacy. And as you progress through your career, you will touch on each of those three domains, or you might end up doing all three. I think the second area is, of course, then being connected to institutions who would help support you in those. So obviously advocacy, you're talking about the Royal College. I'm biased. I think we've got a fantastic Royal College, as I'm sure you'd all agree. And I think the college has moved on a lot, but there is still much to do. But there are other institutions that college then connects to support in that key domain of advocacy, because some of these countries, that's what they desperately need. They need to be able to convince governments that they need to spend their sort of scarce resource on healthcare, on basic healthcare. And so I think we're the right people because we're enthusiastic and we're passionate, and we need to decide which bit of our career we're going to dedicate to those three domains, and that will ultimately, pay benefit. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for your questions and for those answers. Just to highlight that qualitative research has very much become something I'm super interested in. So if anyone has got real interest in that, please do get in touch. Every time I try to get interested in quant now, I just feel like other people are good at that, and the qual seems to be the thing that answers most of the questions I'm really interested in. And I think just to add a little bit to that last question, I think all of those answers were really, really valuable. And I think the key thing is just to keep revisiting it. It's that reflexivity endlessly. Just because you've been doing something and it seemed like the right thing to do for a year, 2 years, to keep looking in that mirror and getting other people to put the mirror up, because although the road was right then, actually the destination's changed a little bit. So that reflexivity, which is a big bit of learning you get from qualitative research, is super important. And I wasn't really a speaker, but I just felt like I would add that in. So we're coming to the end of the day. We're not too late, which is great, but we have a couple of things we need to do before we go. The first of all, we need to announce the winners of our concept carousel, which, by the way, you really all did engage brilliantly with, both speakers and audience, so thank you. Now we can say that's a thing, and then when you do any sort of event, you all have a concept carousel, and then you can quote that we started it. So for the most informative concept, this was awarded to Rebecca Anderson. Now, this is not a fix, by the way, you all voted, because you might wonder with the gecko badges. However, the most interesting concept went to Zosha Bredow.
Staged, it's staged.
So we really must absolutely say thank you to all of you being here, for our concept presenters, but also to our session presenters and workshop presenters. Without you guys, obviously this event wouldn't have attracted so many people to come along, because people wanted to hear what you had to say. And I think we'll all agree that what they had to say was pretty interesting. So we have a tiny token of appreciation of being here. In fact, so it's only Michael who is based in Scotland most of the time, so he won't be tired of Scottish shortbread. So the rest of you can consider it a gift from Scotland. So thank you very much to all of our presenters. Eleanor will find you and give you your box of shortbread. And while Eleanor's finding you all, make it easy for her, please. We also we owe a really, really big thanks to Daniel at the back, who, honestly, this event would not have happened without him. So big thank you.